Hello, everybody. My name is Sarah, and I research terrorism. So if I was to ask you to think about the most horrific acts that you can imagine, they tend to be deliberate rather than impulsive acts which result in the largest loss of life. Now, I'll give you an example of a deliberate act, an act of terror. So somebody has put an awful lot of effort into convincing themselves that this is the right thing to do. Sadly, in 2015, we saw a 172% increase in civilian deaths from acts of terror. Now, to really put that in perspective, most of us will remember the Paris attacks. On that day, around the globe, 115,500 people lost their lives in one day. Yeah. So the problem is big, and it's not surprising that the single biggest security threat facing almost every government body in 2018 is terrorist recruitment. So how do people join terrorist groups? So the culprit, so to speak, is sort of a sneaky one. Terrorists try to recruit using propaganda, and what better way to get propaganda out there than to use the internet? So with the dawn of the internet, the dissemination of terrorist propaganda online has seen unprecedented increases. And to put this in perspective, in 2015, the number of European citizens like me or you leaving mainland Europe to go and fight with terrorist groups abroad has doubled. So, what we're trying to understand is why these people join these groups. The problem with terrorist propaganda or terrorist narratives is that they tend to be very one-sided. So ISIS are not quoting the parts of the Quran where Allah says you're not allowed to kill civilians. And the IRA, for example, they don't include the opinions of their, Protestant counterparts when they're talking about a united Ireland. If they did this, the narrative wouldn't be as effective. So you have potentially very vulnerable people getting exposed to one side of a story. And this one side of a story triggers this complex psychological process known as radicalization. So the person becomes radicalized through these terrorist narratives. Now, what I'm trying to do is to counter these narratives and to prevent radicalization using a really cool tool called a counter-narrative. So what that tries to do is after a person watches propaganda, the counter-narrative challenges it, it contradicts it, and it tries to show the inconsistencies in the propaganda, encouraging the person to think, really think about the information they're receiving. So what I actually do, so far I've tried to see what a counter-narrative might look like, and believe it or not, I've actually managed to speak to a lot of former terrorists in my research. From this, I've sort of started to get an idea of what's going to sink in with these guys, what's going to convince them otherwise. And this means I can create a counter-narrative model, which I'm going to test next year. Now, the impact of this is pretty cool. Terrorist organisations exist because of recruits. Recruits join terrorist organisations because they become radicalised. A person becomes radicalised because they have one side of the story. Military solutions are not going to work, words are going to work. So maybe we should talk to them.